Hello there, my fellow nerds and fellow NET English aspirants. So what today is most exciting topic of all time, you can say. So get ready to have your curiosity sparked because I have got some juicy news for you. And tell me what, guess what it is? The topic that's sending waves of excitement through the exam prep universe. And it is none other than Philip Sidney and his mind-blowing apology for poetry. And guess what, again, you have got like 100% chance of encountering a question about it in the exam. So yeah, you heard me right. So picture this: you're sitting in an exam hall and your heart pounding with anticipation. Suddenly the question appears on your computer, and there it is, like a shining beacon of hope amidst the sea of uncertainty. And you can almost feel the energy buzzing around the exam hall as everyone realizes this golden opportunity that they have been waiting for, right? And but why, you might wonder, that is this topic causing such a... Well, my friends, let me tell you, this is the first video of a series, and it is the gateway to 100 most expected topics. And what better way to kick this off, this epic journey, than with the enigmatic Philip Sidney and his defense of poesy. But here's the deal, my nerds. This topic is not just a mere possibility. It's a, like practically a guarantee. You can't afford to ignore it. So buckle up, grab your popcorn or get your coffee or your favorite study snacks, because this class is going to be long, because we are going to cover every single thing that Sidney has done and what is there in Apology of Poetry. And we are going to embark on this thrilling journey through the world of Philip Sidney and of course his Apology for Poetry. So get ready to conquer that exam and become the envy of all your fellow aspirants. Remember this is just the beginning of an incredible adventure. So stay tuned for next installment of 100 most expected topic. So but for now, let's dive headfirst into this mesmerizing world of Philip Sidney and his Apology for Poetry. Are you excited? I'm excited. So let's start this and let's conquer the exam like a true English film, right? So anyway, let's start with the biography and his literary career, and which is these days in exam they are asking mostly about the career, the life. So before we jump into his major works, we should talk about his life and what was there in his life, what kind of events and things have happened in his career. Let's find out. So Sidney grew up surrounded by strong women, and it showed it in his writing. His female characters are complex and well developed, from the charming Estella, you remember, and to the bold and beautiful princess of Philoclea or Pamela. And C.S. Lewis even said that Sidney's female characters were without equal before William Shakespeare. Sidney's most ambitious works, the Old and New Arcadia, were written with the help of his sister. Can you tell me who was the sister? Write in the chat box and comment if you remember. Anyway, I'm going to spill the bean for you, and that is Mary Sidney Herbert. Mary was a great patron of writers, and she went on to serve as Sidney's literary executor after his death. So this dude, our Sidney, was born at Penhurst Place in Kent to a fancy family. He went to some posh schools like Shrewsbury School, and there is also Christ Church, Oxford. And his dad was Sir Henry Sidney, and his mom was Lady Mary Sidney. Remember the name? She was a big shot too. You know why? Because being the daughter of John Dudley, the first Duke of Northumberland, and the sister of Robert Dudley, the first Earl of Leicester, his sis Mary was writer and all that, and she married some guy named Henry Herbert, who was the second Earl of Pembroke. Well, there is so bunch of complication there. You don't have to pay attention. Just move. That Sidney dedicated his biggest work, which is the Arcadia, to her. After Sidney died, Mary tweaked the Arcadia and became known as the Countess of Pembroke's Arcadia. His brother Robert Sidney, on the other hand, was into politics and the arts, and got himself the title of Earl of Leicester or Leicester in 1618. Sidney's mom, Lady Mary, was a real kind and influential person. She was a lady in waiting to the Queen and got infected with smallpox in 1562. While taking care of Elizabeth, who also had the sickness, sadly her face got badly messed up because of the disease. So she started avoiding going to court. Apparently, according to Ben Jonson, in the conversation with Drummond, and you're wondering why this is important, that this incident and event is important because Ben Johnson in the conversation with Drummond, he said that when Lady Mary had to be in the public, she would wear a mask. And Sidney's certain sonnets like 8 to 11 talk about how disease can ruin a beautiful face. And it's possible that these poems were influenced by his memories of his mom's tough time. So these background somewhat is important. And in his book, New Arcadia, he paints a picture of a woman named Parthenia who suffers a lot because of her looks. But her lover, Argalus, still chooses to marry her. So this situation clearly reflects his mom's struggles and his dad's unwavering love. Sidney was a talented writer who excelled in various forms of literature. But interestingly, none of his work were published while he was alive. What a sad story, right? But anyway, one of his greatest accomplishments was a collection of 108 love sonnets. And can you tell me what it is? Write in the chat box if you know. Anyway, you know what I'm going to do. I'm going to spills the beans for you now. And these sonnets dedicated to his wife, but written about his mistress, Lady Penelope Rich. And it display genuine emotional depth in a beautiful old-fashioned language. They show Sidney's skill as a sonneteer, putting him right up there with the Shakespearean as the best of the Elizabethan era. So it was not only Shakespeare, but Sidney was also considered among his contemporary. So Sidney was a big fan of Italian poetry and also criticism. But he didn't bring it up when talking to Langius, just like many people at the time. He thought highly of Italian literature and it had a major impact on his own work. And he thought highly, about Italian literature, and of course it has major impact on his writing career. So as you can see, in the defense of poetry, Sidney mentions Dante's Beatrice from the Paradiso, and making him the first Englishman to do so. And he also brings up Jacopo Sannazaro a couple of times in the same work as Sannazaro's Arcadia 1504. So you can see how Italian literature had major impact in his work. And this Sannazaro's Arcadia helped shape Sidney's understanding of pastoral romance. And if you're wondering why I'm trying to tell all these things, because this is the question that they have asked about. Like last time they asked that Arcadia was inspired from where, from what work. So that is there, Jacopo Sannazaro Arcadia, and it was about Spanish, right? And helped shape Sidney's understanding of pastoral romances. So here we come. Again, there was another question about Ludovico Aristo's Orlando Furioso. And can you tell me what it inspired? Anyway, I'm going to tell you a story about it. As we know that Orlando Furioso, sorry for that, story about a brave hero. It's a story about a man who's brave, and it also gets mentioned twice in the defense. And that is why this point is quite important. And what it influenced, this, work influenced the characters of Pyrocles and Musidorus in Sidney's Arcadia. Although Sidney tries to resist the influence of Petrarch and his followers in Astrophil and Estella, you can see traces of Petrarchian throughout his work, right? So this is all quite important. So Essex got hit by a really nasty bout of dysentery that spread like wildfire in Ireland. And sadly, he kicked the bucket on September 22nd, 1576 in Dublin. And what bucket is that? Let me tell you. Sidney, who got a letter telling him to rush to the Earl's bedside, showed up too late. When he got there, he found this heartfelt message written by the Earl in his final days. And can you guess what it is? So basically, the Earl said he didn't leave Philip anything in particular except for a wish that if God manages to touch both their hearts, he might marry my daughter. The Earl went on to say that Philip is very smart and virtuous and handsome, and if he keeps going down the path he's on, he'll be as famous and worthy as any gentleman England ever produced. So this daughter, Penelope Devereux, would later become Stella in Sidney's Astrophil and Estella. Now you have the idea why I was telling you this story, because that was the model that Sidney has taken, who in his Astrophil and Stella. This daughter named Penelope Devereux. So remember this name. So aside from his sonnet, as we know, Sidney had other notable literary achievement. So during his time away from court, he penned what? Astrophil and Estella, which was published in 1591, and the first version of the Arcadia and the Defense of Poesy. The Arcadia, his pastoral romance, was published in 1598, tells a complex love story that embodies the ideals of medieval chivalry, which resonate with Sidney's own sensibilities. The story can be a bit convoluted, with many side love stories taking the focus away from the main plot, and the characters are somewhat vague and idealized. So in terms of a style, Sidney's prose has a poetic quality, melodic and picturesque, but at times it can feel a bit artificial and ornate. However, the story does contain several beautiful lyrics. So around the same time, Sidney crossed paths with, guess who? Edmund Spenser, who dedicated his work, The Shepherd's Calendar, to Sidney. That question they have asked in recent exam, right? So Sidney also had literary connections with his friends and fellow poets, including Fulk Greville, Edward Dyer, Edmund Spenser, and Gabriel Harvey. They formed a group called the Areopagus. Remember this name, when aimed to bring classical influences into English poetry, although it might have been more of an imaginary concept than an actual formal association. So later that year, he joined Sir John Norris in the Battle of Zutphen, fighting for the Protestant cause against the Spanish. In the heat of the battle, he got shot in the leg and ended up dying from an infection called gangrene 26 days later, at the young age of only 31. So there's a story that says his death could have been avoided, and it's quite heroic. And apparently Sidney noticed that one of his soldiers wasn't fully armored. So being the noble guy as he was, he took off his own leg armor because he didn't want to be better protected than this man. Right? And as he lay there dying, he even managed to compose a song to be sung at his deathbed. Another famous story about him goes like this. While he was wounded, he gave his water to another injured soldier, telling him, "Your need is greater than mine." It's meant to show what a noble and brave guy he was. That story even inspired a biologist named John Maynard Smith to come up with a problem in signaling theory called the Sir Philip Sidney. Hey, quite an interesting character, I must say. But anyway, that was all about the life of Philip Sidney, right? and we'll move to the major works. So we'll talk about Astrophil, the Countess of Pembroke, and the Lady of May. How many of you did you know that he has written a drama called The Lady of the May? Write in the chat box quickly. Okay, anyway, let's talk about Astrophil and Estella. So there's this collection of sonnets and songs called Astrophil and Estella, which, as we know, is written by Sidney back in the 1580s. So it got like 108 sonnets and 11 songs. Remember, the title comes from a Greek and Latin word that means star lover and star. So Astrophil is the star lover and Estella is his star. Sidney kind of took, some stuff from his Italian inspiration like Petrarch, like having a sort of ongoing story that's not totally clear. Philosophical musing on love and desire, and thought on the art of writing poetry. Sidney even uses the same rhyme scheme as Petrarch, but he switches it up and uses 15 different variations. So some people think that the love depicted in the poem might be based on Sidney's own experience. Remember the girl that we talked in the beginning? Tell me the name if you remember, write in the comment and chat box quickly. So it's believed that Astrophil represented Sidney himself, and that Estella represent Lady Penelope, who was probably Penelope Devereux, and she later became Lady Rich after marrying Robert Rich, the third baronet. So Sidney and Lady Penelope were actually engaged when she was a kid, but something happened and they broke it off. Then she ended up marrying that Lord Rich, but it seems like they weren't too happy together. Some folks even think that Sidney created a poetic persona that's separate from himself, while still drawing on his own experience. So that is all about Stella. You only have to remember that it has 108 sonnets and 11 songs. Right, that will be enough for you guys. And then we'll move to the Countess of Pembroke's Arcadia, published in 1593. So let me tell you, quickly about this, and we'll move to the next slide. But anyway, so this Countess of Pembroke, Arcadia, also known as just the Arcadia, it is a very long pastoral romance. And it was written towards the end of the 16th century. It's like his epic masterpiece, almost as important as his sonnets. So the story is really complex. It takes place in this magical land called Arcadia, where shepherd boys hang out and take care of their cows. I'm just asking you to imagine all this, okay? So you'll create good picture in your mind and it will be easy to remember in the exam. But anyway, they won't ask the plot, they will only ask the character, but we're gonna talk about plot also. So the main characters are, remember, Duke Basilius, his wife Gynecia or Gynecia, G with Y, Gynecia, and their two beautiful daughters. That's what we need to remember, Pamela and Philoclea. So if you remember another character, Pamela, by who? Write in the chat box quickly. So then these two princes named Musidorus and Pyrocles show up and fall head over heels for the princesses, and they disguise themselves to get close to them. So that this guy Musidorus pretends to be a lady and Pyrocles act like a shepherd. And you'll be wondering what's going to happen next, right? So things get messy when the king and queen both fall in love with Musidorus, thinking he's a lady. What a plot twist, guys. Anyway, once they find out the truth, the king takes him to a woman and the queen tries to win his heart. Luckily, with Pyrocles' bravery, the girl manages to escape and Musidorus gets away from the whole mess. Wow. At least his ass got saved, right? But anyway, he runs off with Pamela and all the complication eventually gets sorted out. Well, this is not all. Critics have had their mixed opinion about Arcadia. Some say it's all about ideal love, friendship and rulership, and it's all presented in a reality idealistic way. So the writing style is pretty fancy and full of conceits. For example, Sidney compares cool wine approaching a lady's lip to being a super happy, and when dainty ladies have water drops on their body, and he says it's like they're crying. So the names that beautiful ladies speak are said to be perfumed by their breath. And when the princes put on their clothes, the clothes are described as happy. Some critics didn't appreciate this style because calling it dull and an abuse of intellectual power. Sidney actually wrote two versions of it. Arcadia. The old one was simpler and started as a way of entertaining his sister. And the new one is a way longer and has extra episodes like the story of that rebel MPLS. And sadly, Sidney didn't finish revising the new version before he died in 1586. So in a nutshell, Arcadia is a wild ride of love, disguise, and escape set in a magical land. Some people loved it, while others thought it was kind of boring, but it definitely left its mark on literature and inspiring other works like King Lear and also Pamela that I asked you about. And one more thing, it is also important for our exam, right? So anyway, so that is all about the Countess of Pembroke's Arcadia, Old Arcadia or New Arcadia, whatever you call it, man. But anyway, the Lady of May here, it's very short. Anyway, so in the beginning I asked if you knew about that drama, that play. And you should write yes in the chat box. But anyway, let's move to the Lady of May. And it was published in 1598. It is a very short play. And it's a cool play that has this fancy sounding thing called pastoral. That is why it's quite important. And it's got some hidden messages about Queen Elizabeth I. That could be amazing. But let's see. The first, these play, they first performed it as the Earl of Leicester fancy house in the countryside. And that is called Vansad. And the Lady of May is a very super attractive and this girl who lives in the countryside and has a tough decision to make. She has got two dudes, right, chasing after her, but she doesn't really love either of them. The first guy who's head over heels for that lady, and there is this dude called Aspilus and the rich Safford. And he's not exactly the most outstanding guy, but he doesn't have any major flaws either. And there is one man, there is two men, right? One we talked about. The second is Theron, and who's very charming, but sometimes hot-headed faster. And he's got his good quality, but he's also got some, quite issues. So that is all about the Lady of May, very short play, and that is done. And we will move to an apology for poetry, which is like 100% that in your exam they're going to ask it. And if you want to watch full video on apology for poetry, stay tuned, because right now I'm gonna just stop for now, and in our next class, not next hour, I'm anyway going to continue with this, and it is in our app. The full videos you can only get into the app, right? So make sure you subscribe. Remember, in like $9.99 you will get 100 most expected questions. Along with, there are like so many things. Past papers explanations are there, right? And also mock tests are there, rapid fires are there, man, notes are there. What else do you want? There will be live session in between. And also we have NET JRF already students that the faculties that they are going to teach all about all the literature, American, Indian and all. So definitely you should join if you can afford. Anyway, it's not the question of to afford, but it's the question, do you really want it? Come on, subscribe the channel and also enroll into the course. I'll come back with the full video, and if you are watching this in the app, then you don't have to go right now. We are going to continue. An apology for poetry, 1595. We are going to continue. And as here you can see, there are so many things that we're going to learn, right? And there's going to be a big class because we are not leaving anything behind, right? Every single point, because that's the 100% chance that you're going to get the question. And for that, we have covered almost like everything. We have every single points, every single also the question that they have asked. All the question we have collected like 50 or 100 question maybe that you'll find in your app. And of course, we'll give you the whole this PPT also, and along with whole notes, and which will have 100 questions as well, and whatever the question they have asked and whatever the question you might face, all will be there in the notes that you can find in your app, right? So anyway, let's begin. We'll move to the Sidneys. What is an apology for poetry? As we know, during the years like 1979 to 1584, Sidney was really active in writing. So that was the time that he was mostly active in writing. And it's believed that he wrote the defense of poetry during the winter of 1579 to 1580 as a response to Stephen Cusson's School of Abuse. That question you have already found in this exam also, previous also, and before that also. So that is quite like, you should remember this. It should be imprinted in your brain also, because whenever this question comes, I think you all know, because this question that they have been asking the same, again and again. So that should not be a problem. You will remember that. But anyway, this Stephen Cusson School of Abuse, which came out in the summer of 1579 and was dedicated to Sidney without his permission. Since Cusson's work was connected to Sidney's, and Sidney was also mentioned in what Spencer Safford's calendar, which was published in 1579, and it was Spencer who has dedicated this to Sidney, right? And it suggests that Sidney started working on the defense of poetry that year itself. And considering the strong argument in the work, it's possible that Sidney completed it in a relatively short time. However, it wasn't actually published until 1595, when two different printers released editions. And the official printer for the Sidney family was, as we know, William Ponsonby. That is very important, which registered the defense of poetry on November 29, 1594. But he waited until the following years to publish it. And before Ponsonby's version came out, another edition titled An Apology for Poetry was published by Henry only. So that's the confusion there. Remember, sometime it is mentioned as An Apology for Poetry, and somewhere it is mentioned as the defense of poesy. So both are the same, but because, as we know, the defense came out earlier than the apology, that's why it's a little bit confusing, right? So you remember both the name, that who published in under what name. So the defense of poetry published by William Ponsonby, and the other, which was actually came before Ponsonby's version, that is called An Apology for Poetry by Henry Olney, right? So you remember that. It's quite important point that we always forget, and that they might ask. So till now they didn't ask about it, but who knows? So the class is all about that, and we are going to cover everything, whatever is there. So the defense of poetry is hands-on the most important critique of poetry written by an Englishman during the Elizabethan era. It's like a classic piece of work, as we know. Even though it reflects Sidney's Protestant belief, it's not just some religious thing. Sidney draws on a bunch of old and foreign texts to defend poetry from its critic, and argues that poetry is actually awesome. He believes that poetry can help make our messed up souls better by leading us to perfection. Sidney being trapped in a, so where we were? Okay, we were talking about that he believes that poetry can help make our messed up soul better by leading us to perfection. So despite being trapped in our imperfect bodies, he structures his argument in 7 parts, following the old school classical style, starting with an intro and going through proposition, division, examination, refutation, and ending with a strong conclusion. So that is all the parts of the defense of poetry, or an apology of poetry, for poetry, sorry. And he even throws in a side note on a related topic, right? So Sidney starts up, so this whole thing starts with one quote, and he was saying that the poetry is the root of all other forms of learning. Quite important. Opening is always important, that you should remember that. So Sidney starts by saying that poetry is the root of all other forms of learning. The Roman calls poet what? Vetus. Remember that name, Vetus, which means diviner or prophet, just like David was in his Psalms. And the Greeks called poets what? Makers. And the English use the same term derived from the Greek word poiene, meaning to make. And true poetry either improves upon what nature creates or invents entirely new things. So, according to Sidney, nature is ordinary, but poets create extraordinary world, right? So, Sidney then explains the poet creates these extraordinary worlds by combining an idea with an image. The poet's skill lies in the idea or concept of the work, not just the work itself. And we know the poet has this idea because they present it with such excellence as they had imagined it. So this union of concept and images has like a powerful effect on the human will, motivating it to replicate the virtue portrayed in the poetic creation. For example, if readers understand and appreciate Xenophon's character, Cyrus, they may be inspired to emulate his virtue. The ability of the poetic image to be replicated and understood by others is what sets poetry apart from nature, right? And it is through the ongoing replication of poetic images that our creative intellect can counteract the negative influence on our desires. So basically, Sidney wraps up his discussion by stating his main ideas, which is the important definition of how poetry works. He says that poetry is an art of imitation, just like Aristotle called it, mimesis. So Sidney mentioned about Aristotle's mimesis, and he says that poetry is an imitation, is an art of imitation, right? Which means representing, pretending, or showing. To put it metaphorically, poetry is like a picture that speaks. And the purpose of this speaking picture is to both teach and entertain, drawing inspiration from ideas borrowed from Plutarch and Horace. So these two names were also there, presented there in Sidney's apology. So this definition, which focuses on the active nature of poetry, sets the foundation for all the theories discussed in the defense of poetry. So in this part, Sidney talks about different types of poetry and their practitioner. He categorized them into three groups. And what are the three groups that I'm going to tell you? First is divine poets who imitate the incomprehensible greatness of God, such as David, Solomon, and even pagan poets like Orpheus, Amphion, and Homer. Although he acknowledged their incorrect understanding of divinity, so then there are poets who imitate philosophical subjects. So first was, we talked about divine poets, right? Then there are poets who imitate what? Philosophical subject, which can be further divided into moral, natural, astronomical, and historical theme. So however, what Sidney's main focus lies on the right poets. So these poets imitate to teach and delight, creating their own imaginative worlds without borrowing from existing reality. They delve into the divine possibilities of what could and should be. So within this group, there is also a hierarchy, and ranging from heroic poets to pastoral poets and others who are known by the subject matter they explore or the type of verses they prefer to write. Sidney emphasizes that verse is merely an embellishment and not the essence of poetry. Instead, the essential aspect is the art of creating vivid depiction of virtues, vices, and other aspects, combining delight and instructive quality, which distinguish a true poet. So there's this whole competition going on, right? The poet, who's our main guy here, as we know, and is being compared to these other dudes who think they're all high and mighty in terms of knowledge. First up, in the moral philosopher, all serious and boring, right? With his definitions, divisions, and fancy talk about virtue. Then we have the historians. So it is a fight against these all people. So the poet are being compared here by philosopher and historian, that who is all about the past, it knows everything but doesn't really relate to the present. Then the philosopher claims that he's the best guide to virtue because he teaches what it is, how to destroy vice, and how to control our passions. On the other hand, the historian argues that he's better because he teaches virtue through real life examples like battles and stuff, instead of just abstract ideas like the philosopher. It's an ongoing argument with no end in sight. Sidney steps in and basically says, hey, the philosopher gives advice and the historian shows you how it's done. Of course, what he says, the poet is like the cool middle ground between philosopher and the historian in the school of learning. So poets, they use mimesis, this fancy technique of art, to bring together the philosopher's teaching and the historian's real life example. It's like they paint a perfect picture, combining the big ideas with the specific instances. So poets have these awesome guidelines they include in their storytelling. Things like anger, wisdom, self-control, bravery, friendship, guide, pride, cruelty, and ambition. But the best of them all is when they show us the ultimate goodness, just like Xenophon did when he made up that prince in Cyrus, or when Virgil created that virtuous dude Aeneas, or even when Sir Thomas More crafted a whole imaginary society in his book Utopia. By the way, speaking of More, let me take a quick detour here. See, Sidney believes that if a poetic creation turns out flawed, it's the poet's fault, not poetry itself, right? And just to top it off, he brings up Jesus as an example because Jesus was totally into telling lively stories to teach important stuff. Now we'll move to the another slide, which is here, where we will talk about. So we are just going to continue. The poets made up stories can teach us the similar just as much as the real life examples. And Sidney cleverly points out that you can even save your nose by reading about someone else's cutting of theirs. So like that guy, Zophyros, who tricked the Babylonian, the poet's ability to move was even more powerful than the philosopher's teaching. So according to Aristotle and his fancy words for knowing and doing, basically poetry can turn even the scariest stuff like battles and monsters into something enjoyable. Can your philosophy do that? No, right? Can the past show that? No, right? So he's still continuing, and it's so effective that even speakers and prophets have used it to get their messages across. So remember, when Menenius Agrippa calmed down the angry Romans with a story about a rebellious body hurting itself by starving the stomach. Yeah, that's the power of poetry. And Nathan the prophet, he taught David an important lesson by making up a story that was totally true in a divine way. So in another part of Defense of Poetry, Sidney talks about different types of poetry and warns against being too strict about categorizing them. So till now, what we have understood, that he's talking about poets, he's comparing poet against who? Philosophy and history. And he's talking about what philosophy does and what history does, right? And what poetry does, why it is about what philosophy and history. So that what we have studied so far, right? So the idea you're getting, and whatever we have studied so far, we have talked about so far. We also talked about some of the example that we have taken, right? What Sidney has taken anyway. So that is what happened. That's what we have studied so far. Now we'll talk about the defense of poesy, the other part. Sidney, now here what he's going to talk, he will talk about different types of poetry, and he's going to warn against being too strict about categorizing them. So he mentions that some poem combine 2 or 3 genres. So it's very important, that question they ask. 3 genres, like the tragic and the comical, which gave rise to the genre known as tragicomedy. He suggests looking at the works of Jacob Sannazaro and Boethius. Right, he suggests looking at the works of Jacob Sannazaro and Boethius. Remember that we have talked about in the life of and his literary career in that section. That's why it was important that we have discussed before. So now you'll understand all these important things are quite matter, especially while we talk about the defense of poetry. So this Jacob Sannazaro and Boethius, who mixed prose and verse, as well as those who blended heroic and pastoral themes. So according to Sidney, if separate genre are considered good, then combining them shouldn't be seen as problem, right? So mixing things up can actually be a good thing. So he actually supports, right, that we can combine both the genre or any genre together, like here in tragicomedy. So Sidney goes through different types of poetry and starting from the lowest and working. Right. So remember that he has also defined this poetry through the class. So that you have to remember. So starting, the lowest one is what? It starts with lowest and goes to the highest. So he talks about pastoral, elegy and comedy, lyric, and finally the epic of heroic genre. So Sidney believes these deserves the most respect. And he thinks that the epic genre, I'm repeating it again because it's very important, that the epic genre is the best kind of poetry because it's heroic, it has heroes like Achilles, Cyrus, Aeneas, Turnus, Tydeus, and Rinaldo. Not only these, teach and move us, but they also teach and move us toward the highest and most excellent truths. So that's why Sidney put epic to the highest level. And in other words, they inspire us to reach for greatness. Sidney concludes this section by what? By summarizing his main points, and they are: poetry deals with universal ideas. Poets have the freedom to explore their own unique perspectives. Poetry teaches us valuable lessons and brings us joy. And even the scriptures and Christ himself have used poetry. All of this leads Sidney to believe that poetry deserves the same level of recognition as the laurel crown given to victorious leaders. Right. So that was here, and we'll continue. Third slide is here, fourth one. So these arguments won't likely change the minds of those who hate poetry, he goes on to say. And he calls these, people, calls them what? Poet haters. So these individuals mistakenly associate poetry only with rhyme and verses. Even though Sidney admits that poetry often uses verse because it helps in remembering things better, right? But putting this complaint aside, Sidney starts his rebuttal by saying that poetry and poets face four main accusations: that they distract people from pursuing more useful knowledge, that poetry is full of falsehood, that it promotes abusive behavior and corrupt desire, and that even Plato, in his ideal society, described in the Republic that poet should be banished, right? So here he mentions about Plato. So that is very important points that we have to remember, right? So of course these accusations are made by weak argument that Sidney will easily dismiss. He has already proven the first accusation to be false because poetry alone has the power to teach and inspire virtue. Sidney boldly declares, "I completely deny that any other form of knowledge is as fruitful as poetry born out of the earth." As far as the second accusation, now he is bringing the second one, that poetry promote falsehood. Sidney counters with a spirited response that foreshadows key ideas found in structuralist and post-structuralist theory of language, such as the arbitrary nature of words and the importance of differences. So with great confidence, Sidney addresses the third accusation, that poetry encourages what? Not only love but also lust, vanity, and even scrutiny if they wish to find it. So this seems to contradict Astrophil's failed attempt to elevate his desire into spirituality. So Sidney argues for that accusation that if love poetry leads people astray, it is not poetry misusing human intellect, but rather human intellect misusing poetry. Furthermore, contrary to claim that poetry weakens the spirit of warriors and promotes abuses. And for that, Sidney has a reply for that too. Sidney points out that poetry often accompanies soldiers in battle. As Plutarch tells us, when Alexander went to war, he left his teacher Aristotle behind but took Homer with him. What a beautiful thing, right? He said he didn't take Aristotle, but he took what? Homer with him. That's so beautiful. I think you should remember that. They asked. So I'll just talk about one more time. As Plutarch, what tells us, when Alexander went to war, he left his teacher Aristotle behind, but took Homer with him. So, see how much he's just stressing that poetry is above from all other form of literature. So Sidney tackles the final accusation, and that accusation is what? Against poet. And these accusation was like these haters claim that Plato, the famous philosopher, banned poets from his ideal republic. Sidney takes this seriously because he greatly respects Plato and considering him the most poetic philosopher. But if Plato would dare to discredit the source from which his, own ideas flowed, Sidney says, let's take a look at why he did it. He argues that philosophers have turned the wisdom conveyed by poets, which is full of divine charm, into a dry academic discipline, and they discarded their poetic guides like ungrateful apprentices. Sidney brings up example again for Homer. Examples of Homer. Like Homer, who was cherished by 7 cities while many rejected philosopher. His mentions Simonides and Pindar, who turned a tyrant into just king through their poetry. While Plato himself ended up being controlled by Dionysius, a tyrant, and to really make his point, Sidney also says, reminds all the readers that Plato and Plutarch, another famous writer, approved of homosexuality, which he finds utterly repulsive. It's clear throughout the defense of poetry that Sidney owes a lot to Plato. And he's not afraid to challenge him on a certain issue. But he also respects that. And that was like it was asked in this exam. Right? There was one point, there was some statement question, and that they asked about that. So that's why we are not leaving anything behind. We are covering everything. I hope you're still there because it's getting long class, right? Let me zoom. I think you will be able to see. Yes. So, after pointing out all the terrible things Plato said about poets, Sidney turns out and defends his imaginary opponent. He says that when Plato banned poets from his idealist society, he was actually just criticizing those poets who had wrong ideas about God, which Christianity has already debunked. Plato himself actually praised poetry as a divine force in his work, Aeon. And in fact, Plato's teacher, Socrates, spent his later years turning Aesop's fables into verse, and his student Aristotle wrote a whole book called The Poetics. And let's not forget Plutarch, who adorned his philosophy and history with the beauty of poetry. So it's clear that these philosophers didn't have such a big problem with poetry after all, right? So this is all that. But now we'll move to the another point. So after his strong rebuttal, which unexpectedly influenced his future work, Sidney goes off on a tangent to discuss the sorry state of poetry in England. Now he's coming to that Stephen Gushon, right? He directs his criticism at poets themselves rather than poetry as a whole. He starts by praising the illustrious history of poetry, which used to be revered by kings, emperors, senators, and great captains. However, in idle England, poetry has been reduced to mere trickery, with poets having a reputation as dubious as Venice's mountebank. He laments that unworthy individuals with no genuine talent for poetry have taken it up, as if the muses themselves have been impregnated to produce illegitimate poets. Pretending to find it burdensome to defend poets and their work, Sidney confesses that he cannot resist expressing his thought and ends up paying tribute to them with ink. He then refers to those who actually practice poetry, acknowledging their authority on the matter, returning to the issue of mimesis, which he had previously discussed in the Cyrus passage, right? And Sidney reiterates what? That those who take pleasure in poetry should strive to understand what they are doing and how they are doing it, critically examining their work through the unbiased lens of reason. He emphasizes that poetry cannot be acquired through mere skill or effort. It must be guided gently, or rather, it must guide the poet as it relies on the poet's innate genius. In reaffirming the poets as waiters, Sidney asserts that no amount of industry can create a poet if they do not possess their own inherent talent of it. So Sidney takes a look at the sorry state of poetry in England, and he uses the term poetry in its original Greek sense, which includes all sorts of imagination, literature like drama. He sadly recounts how poets in his time are treated poorly, almost like street performers. And he gets to the root of the problem, which is that many poets are writing without inspiration, just going through the motions. And he repeats the whole saying that a poetry is born and not made. So according to Sidney, there have been a very good poems in England since Chaucer. Hey, he mentions Chaucer's Troilus and Cressida, but oddly leaves out his masterpiece, the Canterbury Tales. And that question they have asked in the exam also. Right. So he also mentions what Sackville and Surrey and Spencer also, but strangely ignores what Langland's Piers the Plowman or Tottle's Miscellany. Why? Because there is a glimmer of hope drama in the form of Garbodak. So when the question comes like, which work Sidney didn't mention. So there will be all the points there, all the options. And remember that he, leaves out the Canterbury Tales and also leaves out what Piers the Plowman. So these two major work at that time, he leaves it out. And he takes what Chaucer's Troilus and Cressida and also Sackville, Surrey and Spencer. And he ignores the Canterbury Tales and Piers Plowman, right? And however, there is a glimmer of hope for drama in the form of Garbodak, although it doesn't adhere to the traditional rules of time and place. Sidney believes that a tragedy should follow the laws of poetry, not history. A playwright should have the freedom to shape history to suit what their tragic needs. Furthermore, Sidney argues that tragedies doesn't always evoke a profound sense of admiration. And he also talks about comedy, and he said, as for comedy, it has degenerated into something farcical or immoral. Laughter is often mistaken for mere entertainment. Sidney emphasizes that comedy should aim to teach and delight, not just provide cheap amusement. Sidney is not optimistic about English lyric poetry either. He sees it as having become dull and artificial in his time. The language is overly affected and the metaphors are forced and exaggerated. However, Sidney praises the English language itself as highly suitable for poetry, capable of adapting to both ancient and modern verse form. His positive view of the English language has opened doors for its future development. So, in his concluding remark, overall, Sidney sums up the merit of poetry and dismisses all the accusations against it as false and unfounded. He passionately argues against the degradation of poetry and criticizes contemporary poets for their lack of genuine love and dedication to the art. He blesses those who appreciate poetry and warns those who scorn it. Sidney Essays is written in a light-hearted manner, providing a spirited response to the puritanical attitude of his time. The ending has a touch of humor, inviting us to fall in love with poetry once again and establishing Sidney as the first great critic. So that is all, guys. We have covered everything. We didn't leave anything behind, right? So to sum up all, we have the keys to remember based on all PYQ questions. So as we know that we have discussed, Sidney is English poet who was also courtier, scholar and soldier. Remember, as one of the most important prominent figure of the English age, as we know, his works include what? Astrophil and Estella, the defense of poesy we discussed like a lot, we didn't leave anything behind. And it is also known as An Apology for Poetry. He also wrote the Countess of Pembroke, Arcadia, and there is another work, The Lady of Mary, we talked about, right? And in Apology, this apology was written, as we know, the date 1580, and it was published only after his death, as we know, 1595. and he was inspired by Stephen Guesson's work, The School of Abuse, which Stephen Guesson published in 1579. And this apology addressed more general objection that we have talked about, such as raised by Plato, remember. And he also gave, much attention is given to Edmund Spencer work. And according to Sidney, have been there three general kinds of poetry, right, that we talked about. The chief being religious, the other imitates that the religious imitate the inconceivable excellency of God that we talked. Another is philosophical, and another is imaginative poetry, which was written by right poet that we talked, and which teach and delight. So Sidney also described poetry as creating a separate reality, and we also covered that Sidney asserted that is no art delivered to mankind that had not the works of nature for his principal object. And Sidney also says that poetry as mimesis by supporting Aristotle poetry as imitation, and he also says that the poet is a creator. And to sum up, the true poet must be able to teach and delight, which is a view that dates back to Horace, who said poetry must teach and please. Then reconfiguring Plato's argument, that he said that Plato's argument was that poet should be banished from his ideal state. And here, what he says, Sidney says that the poets are the least liar. Poets never claim to know the truth, nor make circles around your imagination, nor rely on authority. So Sidney also says that drama is like observing neither rules of honest civility nor of a skillful poetry, and thus cannot do justice to this genre. And poetry leads men to be virtuous, and poetry is superior to history and philosophy. Right? There are also more key points that we have all divided the work. Like here you can see that his apology is divided into exodium, there is narration which teach and delight, and also that comes to lyric that teach and delight. Then propositio that we know, then confirmation, perfection, reflection, digratio, and peroratio. Remember all these points. And again, epic and heroic, we talked about that epic is the greatest, the top, loftiest, inspired, and instruct. Highest form of poetry is epic and heroic according to Sidney. Remember that. The second is what? Pastoral, which teaches humble life. The next which teaches pity. And we have iambic, which is wickedness. Satire is radical, comedy, delight, and laughter, which is also the lowest form of poetry. Right? And he talks about tragedy, uncertainty of the world, pity and awe, the fall of the tyrant, unity of time, place and action. He talks about lyric, praiseworthy, courage. And according to him, poetry promotes virtue. Poets are not liars, but they are least liar, right? And men abuse poetry. Plato banished from the ideal state, but Sidney argues the misuse of poetry. That question they asked. The decline of poetry in drama. Poets are made, not born. So I hope you remember all this. So that's all, guys. We have completely finished, and I think it's 1 hour lecture. But remember, that is one question, 1 hour. You only need 100 hours to get 100 questions, right? So this is our first series in a first topic on most expected topics. This is first out of 100, so there will be 99 more. So I hope everybody will join and get it. 100 topics means you'll at least get what, 60-70 questions, and that is like, marks to get JRF also. So why wait? Get it. Enroll now. If you've watched whole lecture, then I promise you need it. You can buy it. But anyway, thank you so much, and I'm gonna take a leave now, and I'll see you with number 2, which will be anyway, I'll announce later. Thank you so much. Bye bye. Have a great day.